So the first thing I want to say is that this is a published paper that we're basically presenting through to you. So if you do want more, then read more. We're sort of winging it a little bit today, but have done the work, and we do have lots of pretty pictures at least. So, okay, so yeah, and this comes from, I guess, what we're presenting today is from some broader work on marine environmental management in the South China Sea region with the Marine Resources Initiative that Elaine has headed up the last 4 or 5 years. And this is some of the work based in the Philippines, and we're just presenting one kind of small part of that, which is related to state of the environment, state of the marine environment reporting. And then within that, we're going to talk about one component about participatory mapping. But so to start there, to kind of just first explain some of the kind of key concepts leading to what we then decided to do. So understanding the condition and trends of coastal and marine environments is central to achieving the UN SDG Life 14, Life Below Water, and also commitments under UNCLOS, or United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, establishes the obligation of states to protect and preserve the marine environment. That requires that nations have knowledge of the existing pressures on marine ecosystems and their jurisdictions. And one way of collating that information and reporting on that is the state of the environment or state of the marine environment reports, which provide a comprehensive assessment of the health of the environment, usually conducted periodically every 5 years, analyse the best available evidence to guide policy and action. And so this periodic nature, a bit like a census, they provide a snapshot of the current state and state of the environment at that time, identifying key issues, trends and pressures, and then provide recommendations. And so, yeah, the key part being, as I said, is this kind of trends and state. So what is, the kind of health of ecosystems or the health of habitats at a particular moment, and then have they been declining or improving based on interventions or pressures and so on. So we're trying to get some sense of that at a often very broad scale. Oops, wrong one. And so some examples from Australia at multiple jurisdictions. So state of environment reports, but also national level at the top there. But also the one on the top right in Norway is for one particular marine park. And the area that we've been working in, Palawan, which is a province of the Philippines, which we'll come back to, has also state of environment reports, but within those, the portion or the amount of kind of space and information dedicated to marine environments has been limited. Hence some of the justification for the work that Elaine's project was leading on state of marine environment for Palawan.
Okay, so I should also point out, as Billy was saying, this research has been funded through research grants that Elaine has brought in through collaborations with DFAT and GA, but I should also emphasise that these are also the Category 2 grant funds. So although we're delivering on many other aspects in this process, it's actually provided a great opportunity to develop address some research problems that are of particular interest in our research group. So we've made the environment reports, and in Australia, it's actually legislated. So a marine environment report needs to be submitted every 5 years. So the intent is really to provide this sort of, as Billy was saying, this broader understanding of the big picture across different sectors, and also to identify and be able to respond to problems associated across sectors or associated with interactions across sectors. And also to be able to avoid or in some cases respond to system level processes. So when you think about the marine environment, it's highly enigmatic, it's fluid, it's open, currents from many hundreds of kilometres away can affect specific localised areas. But also, so often we're needing to think in terms of feedback loops, cumulative impacts, and also tipping points. Where are these tipping points? And to be able to understand where they are, you need to think, in a sort of more holistic systems-based perspective. So that's really the intent of a lot of these assessments and reportings, but they then consequently rely on a limited number of often information-rich parameters. So you sort of bias towards where data exists in a lot of this reporting. So where data is accessible and where in some cases where it's not, you might develop these really complex spatial inference models. But again, they're dependent on often narrowly defined metrics and data that's available to feed into those models. So what that means is that you get limited defined metrics that might be beautifully depicted and defined in these reports, but it might be missing out, as a consequence, you might be missing out on general trends across larger areas and system level conditions. So that's really what we're interested in here. And to be totally honest, I had trepidations, small trepidations going into this project, because a lot of my work, particularly with Jamie, we're looking at really fine scale, impacts to say seagrass beds. So we've been developing satellite sensors to try and understand sort of centimetre scale changes to the impact, as a consequence of human activities, so anchor scars in seagrass beds. So then to be asked to look at sort of these broader scale systematic perspectives was kind of challenging, for me at least. But the idea is that we need to curate local scale metrics. So often when we're curating these local scale metrics, so for example, impacts on seagrass beds, we then underrepresent the diversity of broader seascapes. And often when we're asked a question or to think about the condition of particular ecosystems, we focus on the sites that we're familiar with. So the idea is, through these sorts of reports and these approaches, is an integrated system level assessment that's used to informed by expert knowledge that provides an alternative in these environments. And if you think about it, we can use satellite data, for example, but satellite data really only gives us information down to about 20 metres depth, unless you've got incredibly pure, pristine water that isn't affected by light attenuation looking at satellite images. So we're wanting to expand beyond those areas, and also that satellite data often not only is constrained spatially, but it doesn't give us a picture. So we might have really detailed information of what's happening on the surface of the water in broader ocean areas. In coastal areas, we've got information down to about 20 metres, but what's going on, what is happening in these other areas? So to address that, many state-of-the-environment approaches have used this concept of expert elicitation. And we'll talk about that really quickly, and then we'll talk about how we've introduced a geographical lens into this approach. So expert elicitation is really it's an established methodology that sort of came about mainly in medical and health sciences. This was first introduced in public health, but it's then been used fairly widely now in resource management and planning. It's mostly valuable in same data poor, large scale problem solving. When we're dealing with complex systems, and the marine environment lends itself really well to that, where detailed measurement is sometimes impractical. So a definition we've thrown in here is it's a consensus-based approach that draws on the collective judgment of field experts to address data and knowledge gaps for policy decision making. So I guess the emphasis here is that to be done well, it has to be done fairly systematically. And so it's not a low cost or low effective substitute for research in areas, but a fairly rigorous technique that complements where available data and knowledge might be insufficient. So basically we're looking for explicit treatment of, well, I guess if you think about it, we're pulling a group of experts into the room and asking them to think about and comment on the condition of the marine environment, whether it's healthy, whether it's not, where species might be distributed and other sort of marine parameters that might be of interest. But when you're often doing that, people are dealing with a level of uncertainty, and cognitive uncertainty is a challenge. And as a consequence, you can have all sorts of limitations associated with this. And this is why you've got to do it in a fairly systematic approach. So the level of and reliability of expert knowledge can vary. So which experts do you bring into the room? How do you identify those experts? When people are dealing with uncertainty, inherently we often rely on, if you like, unconsciously, we rely on cognitive heuristics I'm not going to go into the whole psychology of this because this is a PhD on itself, but you've probably heard of the concept of anchoring and confirmation bias when you're asked questions. So, for example, a bias that might be introduced might be associated with availability. So what data is there where you've gone out and studied? So if you spent a lot of your field time in a particular site, you're probably going to be biased. Your knowledge is going to be biased to what's that site. And you might have a really good understanding of the condition at that site and kind of ignore or overlook other areas. So perhaps your views may not be particularly representative. Anchoring, so if you're asked to think about the condition of an area, so for example, in the Philippines, there's a really popular tourist site called El Nido. I don't know if anyone's been there and seen the incredible damage that has happened to that site. If you're asked to think about or consider the condition of coral areas in Palawan, the island of Palawan, and you think about some of the damage there as your first starting point, and then you adjust your understanding of that condition up or down based, or your interpretation of that condition up or down based on that particular site. You've anchored on that site, and that can introduce a bias in itself. So what in these expert elicitations sort of workshops you attempt to do is to get people to think about extreme conditions, so extreme level of damage or extreme poor condition, level of pollution, or degraded fishing conditions, and best case scenarios. And we'll show you how we actually went about mapping these geographically. So the other challenge with expert elicitation is this pursuit of consensus, and that can or cannot be achieved, and there's all sorts of psychology behind that too. But the subjective nature of often having to aggregate the information. So can maps actually help us try and resolve this problem? So, at the appropriateness of making fairly subjective probabilistic judgments. Some people sit more comfortably with that than others, and some people are more willing to do that in a room than others, and that's often the challenge when you're running these sort of workshops. So the question here as geographers is, can we bring in a spatial element to this? So when we're asking experts to comment on the condition of, say, the impacts of climate change on sea state temperatures and conditions across large marine areas, we're asking them to aggregate that knowledge across different environments. So by introducing maps, can we actually look at avoiding limited capture or representation or aggregation of that knowledge over larger areas? So I'll let Billy take over and explain how we actually went about doing this.
Yeah, thanks. So our study, as I kind of mentioned earlier, was sort of, this particular paper was sort of the study for this sort of inserting itself into a larger activity. And that was an existing expert elicitation workshop that was happening to collect information from experts across Palawan in the Philippines for the State and Marine Environment Report assessment in Palawan. And that happened in 2023 at the University of Sydney, the Marine Resources Initiative Project, provincial government in Palawan, and also Geoscience Australia with DFAT funding. So that was already happening, and the purpose of that was to collect information on the current conditions and trends of marine environment parameters, as well as threats and pressures on those parameters, and then come up with recommendations for Palawan. And so in that context, we introduced a participatory mapping component that was not already being used in expert elicitation workshops to capture spatial knowledge from those marine environment experts on those different parameters. So then experts could mark locations corresponding to those condition and trends information that they were giving. And so in this particular study that we published this paper on, the aim was to evaluate the value of incorporating participatory mapping within those expert elicitation methods to allow geographical variation to be considered without compromising the representation of biophysical diversity required for that integrated system level assessment of state of marine environment reporting. And so we did that by looking at a few different sources of evidence, I guess. So evaluation was based on observations of the activities in the workshop, as well as feedback from participants who were doing the expert elicitation and the mapping activities, as well as then appraisal and analysis of the data that was collected, the spatial data. So looking at the individual maps that people produced, as well as running some GIS analysis on them to see what kind of additional insights could be gained with that geographic component being captured. So before we get into more detail about what we actually did and what we found, just a bit more on some of the kind of key concepts that we're talking about. So the first being participatory mapping. So we're talking about mapping that is engaging non-mapping professionals, largely. Traditionally, that has been Indigenous peoples or the lay public in making maps based on their own spatial knowledge and perspectives, and has often been used for kind of advocating for social change or political agendas and environmental conflicts and so on. But the techniques to do this participatory mapping can be very varied. So things like drawing on the ground together, drawing on paper maps, using digital methods like GIS, and other on online platforms as well. And so the approach is considered more inclusive and democratic than conventional mapping or data collection methods, which are often sort of professional expert driven or top-down approaches. And as I said, has therefore been linked to advocacy and change, but there are some limitations there. So the kind of positive outcomes can be difficult to measure from those sorts of activities. But it has been very useful for generating dialogue across different groups and stakeholders, including in marine management space. So while rooted in representing community voices, participatory mapping has become a much kind of more diverse and more widely used tool in itself. But still that kind of central aim is to gather different forms of information from different people and kind of foster collaboration across those participants. In conservation science, so still with those origins in representation of local community voices, but then becoming a kind of wider applied tool. The use of participatory mapping in this context has increased in recent years and decades, primarily due to the need for rapid assessments of ecological patterns and processes beyond what kind of could be collected, or with the limitations of not being able to conduct sort of large-scale surveys and so on, but really also with that main drive of capturing those kind of local voices. So some examples, in Brazil, participatory mapping with fishes proved cost-effective for accurately identifying fish reproductive migration patterns relevant to fisheries management. An example there from Puerto Rico, where participatory mapping was combined with key informant interviews to help fill data gaps in coral disease monitoring and reef health management. And then the picture on the slide there is where the method was applied to document coastal values and ecosystem services in support of spatial planning. So if we have this sort of original participatory map made, that can then, I keep doing that, that information can be collated, digitized and analyzed to inform marine spatial planning or spatial management of marine areas. And so in this case, we're looking at these ecosystem services and values, monetary, non-monetary, and also threats. And so it's quite powerful spatial information that can arise from quite simple data collection techniques through participatory mapping. But there are some important limitations to the method. They're not all here, but some of them. So participatory mapping can be less effective for capturing intangible cultural values. So some participants may be unwilling to assign perhaps sort of non-monetary values or importance to places sometimes, and also maybe certain types of information shared for plenty of good reasons. So the outcomes depend on participant engagement, willingness to share information and participate in mapping, and also the capacity to map targeted features and attributes. And then there have been concerns raised in literature around quality, privacy, trust, and underrepresentation through participatory mapping, particularly of marginalised groups. And that can limit not only the results, but also the kind of positive outcomes for participants or potential participants, say local communities, for example. And maybe that's that.
Yeah, so we looked into the whole expert elicitation literature. We looked at the participatory mapping literature that has been working for some time now. We've been using participatory mapping. She worked too. Work at Manchester. So we were kind of really interested in how those methodologies could be incorporated into something like expert elicitation in the marine context. The challenge was there's only been, well, when we started, there were only 2 attempts to do this. And so we had 2 papers to base our methodology on. So the first was work in the Antarctic area, looking at using expert elicitation to identify areas that had of conservation need and areas of conservation opportunity. So that particular expert elicitation, sorry, I should say, in the context of state of the marine environment reporting, was done online. So the experts were all in their own offices, linking in remotely and digitising areas based on the GIS style platform. So the results could be analysed fairly easily because it was all done digitally. And what they used is a selection analysis based approach, so the frequency at which sites were selected in terms of conservation importance and conservation opportunity. So that was used in a marine spatial context. What they found is that doing spatial clustering analysis showed that anchoring and cognitive bias, which was some of the stuff I talked about earlier, was fairly apparent because people were including their information independently. It wasn't sort of in a group setting, and it was all remote based and it was digitally based. So they recommended that a workshop based setting could improve on these outcomes by enabling sort of collaboration, discussion, and confirmation of ideas and sharing of knowledge. So that was sort of very much a broad scale through mapping attempt in marine environment reporting. And you can see the maps here. So this shows the frequency of, or selection frequency of areas of conservation importance in Antarctica and where there was conservation opportunities or where perhaps new marine parks could be established. And it became fairly evident that there were sort of hotspots where people tended to focus because they were familiar with those sites. There was another study that was done on an enclosed lagoon on the Italian coast where maps of distribution and abundance of individual fishing species that influenced, this was done to look at fisheries management, were georeferenced their ecological significance of different patterns were then analysed. So the simplicity in that particular technique was that they used paper-based maps. But the thing here is that they were working with expert fishers. So these are the people that are out there on the waters every day. And many had multiple generations of experience and knowledge of that area. So they're really familiar with that marine environment, and it was an enclosed lagoon, so it was a fixed area. So we had the challenge of, I don't know if this is our next slide. So we drew on some of those methodologies, but we really only had 2 case studies to go by. But what we were doing is translating that to one of the most biodiverse, rich, in terms of marine life, hotspots in the world because of the currents that flow on either side of the island of Palawan. Really take over on the site.
Yeah. So I guess we're up to now, we've got a state of marine environment process happening in Palawan in the Philippines, but we don't have a great way of capturing where this kind of conditions, trends and threats are happening. So we've approached, participatory mapping. And so then now we're going to talk through what we actually did and then what we found when we tested that in this case study site. So Palawan is an archipelagic province of the Philippines, roughly 1,780 islands between the Sulu Sea in the east and the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea in the west. It's a global marine biodiversity hotspot with important biodiversity corridors in the north and the south. Coral reefs account for 41.5% of the total area of the group of islands. So it's high conservation significance in the area for reef fishes, as well as mangrove, seagrass, and soft bottom ecosystems. And then in that context, Marine-based activities are an important contributor to livelihoods, coastal household incomes, including fisheries, seaweed farming, aquaculture, and other activities. And the fishing grounds of Palawan are important in the wider Philippines context, with the province accounting for 70% of the country's total live reef fish for food trade, and almost all parts of the province are involved in that industry. And so the entire province was designated a UNESCO Man Biosphere Reserve in 1991. And in our context, with state of environment reports, there have been 5 in the past since 1985. But as I said earlier, they've been limited in their marine information. But this environment is under threat, as everywhere is, but particularly regions like the Philippines. And so the Palawan Council for Sustainable Development, or PCSD, is charged with management and conservation, including of livelihoods. And the Strategic Environment Plan for Palawan, or the SEPLAW, was established in 1992, which provides a comprehensive legal framework for management, sustainable management for ecological viability, but also livelihoods for government, but also other stakeholders. But despite that protection, all those strategies, there's increased urbanisation, mining, unsustainable tourism, overfishing, mangrove clearing, pollution, climate change, and many other ongoing threats that are impacting marine ecosystems in Palawan. And so PCSD's main management strategy is ECAN zoning, so the Environmentally Critical Areas Network, which is a system of zoning areas for higher or lesser protection, or greater or lesser other mission for other activities. And so that includes the terrestrial environment as well. And part of the just kind of rationale for doing the State of Marine Environment report at this time was to help PCSD have information to extend this zoning plan into coastal and marine environments. But in order to do that, there's a requirement for baseline understanding, including spatial information of the current state of marine environment. So hence the work of State of Marine Environment Assessment. And so just a little bit about what we did for that, and then specifically what we did with the participatory mapping component. So the process broadly involves identifying the parameters that will be examined. So some examples here. We're going to look at the current state of these are habitats, so beaches, lagoons, seagrass beds, etc., etc. And then we review literature on those parameters, and then identify and invite provincial and national experts to a workshop. And PCSD largely led that process in this case. So from memory, 88 experts were identified and 59 attended. And then the workshop itself looks something like this. You don't have to have matching t-shirts, but I think it's a simple process. And so in that is where we have people coming together, sharing their insights and discussing and trying to get some sort of consensus about those conditions and trends. And so this is one of the outputs, but it kind of summarizes what the process is. So very briefly, for each parameter, groups of experts were asked, and they were grouped based on their expertise, were asked to comment on the condition and the trend of parameters. So if we look at estuaries and deltas, and they gave them a score out of 10, which is relative, 10 being very good, the lower end being very poor, relative to a 1900 baseline. So where we're saying before kind of mass industrialization and change to these environments, what would a sort of near pristine environment look like? So they have this baseline, and then they are asked to consider what they think are the worst places in the province for that parameter, so estuaries and deltas. What are the worst 10% like? Okay, maybe that's a 2 out of 10. What are the 10% of best places like? Maybe that's a 6 out of 10. And then 80%, so what would you say most places are kind of like? And so that is getting towards some of those biases that Eleanor was talking about. So asking people to consider extremes tries to reduce things like anchoring and recall and other biases. So we're getting a broader range of what the variation is. And so then that's, these scores land estuaries and deltas. And then we asked them on the trend. So in the last 5 years, do you think they have been declining or improving? And we also asked them to add some comments on that. So, oh, it's been declining because there's a new mine, or the health of this species is really been improving because of closed fisheries management interventions or something like that. And then crucially, we asked them about the confidence in those, the grade, so in the condition and also in the trend. So they might say, I have been studying this for 30 years, I've got all this data, I really am, very confident that this is the situation. But there's no red ones on here, but maybe they had low confidence, and they might give some information about that and say, we just don't have data, or this process is new and we don't know what's happening, or whatever that might be. So there's a space for them to add comments, qualitative information to all of these scores. So that's the expert elicitation. And so all of this is happening in discussion, in groups. So we're trying to also eliminate biases as well by having people, hear other perspectives. But there also might not be consensus. There might be some variables where people can't agree, and that might be noted down as well. And we also might identify places where they couldn't do the assessment because it was irrelevant, or there's just no information, and so on. So it's really up to the kind of power in that sense is up to the participants to give us the information. But so within that, that's where our crucial question comes. Okay, so if you've said that estuaries and deltas are in poor condition, or like where are they, or which ones? So that spatial question fits in here. And so for that, the participatory mapping activity that we introduced, it's quite simple, but we gave people A3 base maps at multiple different scales of the of Palawan, and then we had plastic overlays and marker pens, and people were given very simple instructions so they could mark anything that they felt was relevant to the parameters on these maps. And largely that might be areas that match their scores, like their highest condition areas or the areas in decline or so on. But they could also map anything else they wanted. And then when they finished that, we would take an image, take a photo of those maps, and they wipe out the plastic overlay and use it again for a different parameter. And they also had paper that they could write notes to tell us what they were doing. And so, and key to that as well is discussion is happening about the maps or about the mapping as they're doing it. And then we take all the photos of the maps, and then they were georeferenced and digitized in the GIS. And then we have that those spatial layers which can be analyzed in different ways, or prepared individually to accompany the other information about parameters in the report. So that's what we did. But then we had to think about if it was any use. And that was based, as I said earlier, on so during the workshop, we made observations about by the authors, and also each group had a facilitator assigned. And so taking notes of maybe how the discussions are going, where the maps aided the discussions and other aspects. We also then had a wider post-workshop evaluation survey or a questionnaire. And we specifically had questions in there about the mapping component. So we had some data from that. And then we examined the maps themselves for their potential value for enhancing the expert elicitation process. And so that involved looking at the individual maps that were made and what information that we gained about the condition of turtles and where that is, for example, from a map. but also analysing that information together, which we'll show you soon. So looking for if the information provided on these maps could give us some sort of more integrated system level kind of analysis or identification of patterns, perhaps. So maybe where if there are hotspots of best conditioned places or of worse conditioned places. So the results of the State of the Marine Environment report itself, I won't tell you about because it's very long, but I will point you to it. Yeah, there's a 1 hour podcast on that if you want to hear me talking about that in a different format. But just to say that, yeah, so I guess the main point being that this expert elicitation process was or is, successful in producing this kind of broad scale seascape assessment useful for policy and management decision making. So PCSD is using this report as their sort of main reporting document to UNESCO on the status of the Biosphere Reserve, I think last year. It's also the outcome, some of the results for this assessment have informed sort of rethinking that ECAN zoning approach. So some really, useful outcomes of this, but broadly it covers assessment of 165 parameters across 6 thematic areas. So habitats, species, ecological processes, physical and chemical processes, pest invasive species, diseases, and algal blooms, and then also factors affecting environmental values, so threats and pressures on those other parameters. And it takes a driver pressure state impact response approach, which is common of state of environment assessments. And so this image here is summarising some of the key drivers of pressures on the environment. So they're not going to be surprises, but climate change, urbanisation, plastics, pollution, tourism, fishing, geopolitical tensions. And all of that leads to policy and research recommendations. So I'm going to leave that there because the main purpose of our gathering today is about participatory mapping. So within that context, how useful was the mapping? So first to the participant feedback. So 59 people were at the workshop, 52 completed the post-workshop questionnaire. And that was mostly about other stuff to do with the workshop, but these 2 questions were useful for us. So there was a survey question that asked the participants about the usefulness of the workshop for informing future marine environment planning in Palawan, and 85% of 44 responded yes. But that result reflects multiple things. So the methodology and expert elicitation with participatory mapping, but as well as just the workshop setting and other aspects that they liked or didn't, mostly liked. But then specifically, was the participatory mapping component useful? And again, a very positive result. Eleanor and I were discussing earlier that without wanting to generalize too much, but from our experience with this group of people in Palawan and the Philippines, they're a very positive bunch. So
Might see things.
But I don't know, maybe it's just excellent mapping. But we also got some qualitative information through that. So we've summarized this into these points. But some of the strengths, and also there were some weaknesses or some more nuance to this that came out. So things like mapping helped understand issues spatially, providing context, visualize scenario situations, different views, effective way to collate and present ideas. Visual representations are better for information retention for some people. Maps aiding with discussions, being engaging, particularly the paper mapping approach, identifying areas for prioritised interventions, so the actual information being mapped as being useful, and also data gaps. But some of the weaknesses, maps are estimates from experts rather than reliable, verifiable data. But that, I guess, applies to the whole expert elicitation process. Maps reflect the perceptions of only the specific experts at the workshop, same comment. And some important information cannot be captured on the maps. In our case, in the case of, say, of environment reporting, we have all that other information that is being collected at the same time. So the sort of our approach is that introducing this mapping component can enhance what has already been collected. It's not to replace or stand alone from that other data that is required for these assessments. And then when we looked at the actual maps that they produced, while the spatial component for some assessment parameters was either not deemed relevant or by experts, or it wasn't mapped for other reasons, one particular group just totally ran out of time and we said, just don't do the mapping. But where maps were made, there was additional depth of information that was captured that would not have otherwise been collected with just the traditional expert elicitation approach on its own. And so some examples, so this included just marking spatial information directly linked to the main expert elicitation assessment. So the different condition scores, in this case, best, worst, in most places, being highlighted at a pretty kind of coarse scale, but still more information than we would have had otherwise. Or delineating areas that are in decline or improvement or recovery, as is this case, and this is condition of dugongs. But also they marked other information here. So this dashed line that they put on is saying where data was deficient. In this case, they marked the whole province, but others have smaller areas marked. So they're telling us through the map that there's some uncertainty there. They sometimes simply just located the occurrence of the parameter. So in this case, it's ice disease affecting seaweeds, and they just told us where outbreaks had been across the province. And also information maybe related to, but not directly defined by what the expert elicitation assessment was. So in this case, for 4 species of turtle, they're telling us where foraging areas are, where nesting areas are, also areas that they don't have much data on. And so again, this kind of level of information, but also particularly spatial information that we wouldn't have got if we were just using the expert elicitation method on its own. And importantly, these parameters are all considered in the context of their relationship to the wider seascape. So we're still getting this sort of broad seascape picture, even though we're asking them to map sometimes very fine scale things. Okay, Eleanor?
Yeah, so as Billy was saying earlier, like a really important part of the expert elicitation process is to also capture uncertainty, experts or participants' uncertainty around or the confidence they give to a particular parameter that is identified. So that's also where the mapping, like using maps as a reference points, was a really useful way of eliciting that level of certainty around their knowledge. And we talked earlier about various different biases like conformity bias. So the idea that if you're listening to ideas amongst a group of experts and your views seem to coincide with others, that might confirm your bias towards a particular perspective on a condition or parameter. So by having groups of people working around hard copy maps, that it helped sort of those dialogues to come out, which may not have if you're working with sort of an online platform and doing this remotely and independently, which is fantastic until we actually have to deal with how many hundreds of maps, feature points and dots and polygons and whatever. So I'm really fortunate to have the funding to employ a research assistant to very carefully digitise all of those plastic overlays that Billy took photographs of, and then we needed to georeference them, and then we needed to work out how would we actually pull this data together. And so we did focus on the condition aspect of things. We wanted to know where were considered to be the best case conditions, marine conditions, and the worst marine conditions across all the various different parameters that Billy's mentioned. So I think we ended up with 60 maps, parameters, 165 of these expert elicitation assessment parameters. But by the time we distilled all that down, we had about 27 layers of information. And then we used the selection frequency approach that was used in the Antarctic study to identify where you get these hot spots and cold spots of poor and best case conditions. So you can see on the left in the green is where you've got areas that were recorded as having best case situations. So for example, down the southern end of the island, that the reason those areas are coming up as dark green may relate to specific variables, because then you have situations where the same areas are actually being identified as worst case. So that might be a situation where it could be worst case in terms of the impact of sea level and climate-driven stresses on an area, but potentially better case in terms of fishing pressures or tourism pressures or pollution pressures all over the world. So that's why we get in some areas both red and green appearing in the same sites. But what's really interesting is you've got these contested waters out here in the Callian Island group, and they're identifying both certain worst-case scenarios associated species decline and loss of iconic species out, like giant clams and other species out in those areas. But you also have that same area, it's a very vast area, being identified as potentially in almost pristine conditions in terms of pollutants and other parameters. So that's where it's really interesting to be able to have that spatial context. The other advantage of that is you can start overlaying that with the marine plans that we mentioned earlier on, the ECAM plans, which are the marine spatial planning approach for identifying marine protected areas around Island of Palawan. But you can also start overlaying these maps with, I talked earlier about, like, you have species distribution maps or spatial inference maps where you can take some data and then infer species distributions from that. So by being able to overlay those with other model data sets, it provides a powerful tool for working out where there is that spatial constant. And I have, we didn't include it in the paper, but I did have actually overlaid these maps with existing biodiversity measures. And interestingly, there are some spatial coincidences in that. To talk really about, but we can take this work further, which is really interesting. But having that spatial context allows us to do that. All right, I think we're getting close to it.
So yeah,
that's right.
I guess this is just some of the kind of discussion point, or us, reflecting on what this might mean, and I guess. The key points, as Eleanor's just said, the tool enabling inclusive discussion while incorporating geographical context, and reducing potential biases we've talked about. The group mapping can prompt new perspectives. So again, if you have a really diverse group of people, that can be really useful. And also reassessing or revising initial judgments and better understanding potential between expert variation. And the simplicity of the paper-based approach was useful for facilitating contributions during the expert elicitation. So then, glad we're there because of the time. To kind of just finish, participatory mapping in workshop settings strengthened the expert elicitation process in our case. By increasing participant engagement and collaboration, helped mitigate some common expert elicitation biases. Where spatial data were collected, recognising it wasn't for all parameters, the maps provided greater depth of insight and additional analytical opportunities. So the GIS cluster analysis, giving us spatial insights beyond what could be achieved with the expert elicitation, and analysis of participatory maps individually. Expert elicitation and participatory mapping outputs support evidence-based environmental zoning and management, reducing reliance on assumptions or misaligned scale generalizations, and incorporating participatory mapping with expert elicitation methods allowed geographical trends to be considered without compromising the integrated system-level assessment required of the marine environment assessments. So some ideas for future research. So develop a clear framework to quantify the value of participatory mapping. There are other frameworks that exist in other contexts that we could maybe adapt or apply here, rather than just our kind of few lines of evidence that we were looking at. Using standardized mapping to improve data consistency and analysis. So one reason that only 27 parameters were included in the cluster analysis is because they were ones that had like parameters that we could, or data, which was best and worst, because we didn't tell everyone that they had to do that. And I think that part of the kind of epistemological underpinning of participatory mapping is to allow people to express their own knowledge and how they see things. So we didn't want to impose that. But at the same time, it limited some of the analysis. So maybe we can rethink that a little bit. Testing the approach in different contexts with different participant groups. So this marine expert, based workshop involved a lot of different experts, which I didn't talk about. but largely government and other organisations. But maybe if we were to go to a specific local community perspective, we would have different outcomes. And test participatory mapping with exploitation at finer spatial scales. So perhaps a single marine protected area, for example, where the kind of space that people are looking at is perhaps much smaller. And so does the kind of variation of spatial insight still make sense? Because noting that on some of those maps, there was quite coarse areas that were marked. So maybe that's it.